All right, Alexander, we have the response from the United States to Russia's security guarantees that they're looking for, and the United States has responded. We have various statements. Maybe you want to start with Blinken and then shift over to Lavrov, or if you want to start with Lavrov and then shift over to Blinken. Um, just how do you see
Yeah.
it? How do you see the situation?
Well, the United States, as everybody expect, came up with these written responses, something they didn't want to do. They took a very long time doing, but they have responded to these Russian demands, and officially and formally, they've rejected them. And the American responses say that the United States cannot compromise on NATO's open door policy, and the Russians have countered that they find the American response, the NATO response, inadequate and unacceptable, and that they're now going to consider what they're going to do. And there's rumours, by the way, that the Russians, in fact, they're not just rumours, they've been sort of confirmed that the Russians are now going to consult with the Chinese, and they're going to start taking their countermeasures. So, on the face of it, it's a rejection by the US of the Russian demands and a counter rejection by the Russians of the American rejection. But Blinken gave a press conference in Washington, and it was quite interesting because, firstly, it was much more temperate in language and tone than some of his earlier statements. And he made, over the course of that press conference, a comment which I haven't seen anybody mention in any place, but which I did find actually quite interesting. And this is in response to a question. But he said, he was asked, so there's no change in the US and NATO position on the open door policy. And then Blinken replied, there is no change and there will be no change. We reiterate the principle. Of course, it is for NATO, not the United States, unilaterally to discuss the open door policy. These are decisions that NATO makes as an alliance, not the United States, unilaterally. Now, I might be reading too much into that, and we've got to be very, very careful. But those words seem to me to open the door, if you like, to a future discussion about NATO eastward expansion, but on the basis that it will be a negotiation between Russia and NATO rather than a bilateral discussion between Russia and the United States. And if that's right, then Blinken and Biden and the administration can turn around and say, well, we've actually rejected the Russian proposals and we're sticking by our principles. But of course, they're in fact shuffling off the responsibility to negotiate seriously on this issue onto NATO as opposed to the United States, thus washing hands of their responsibility for all of this. So it might not be quite the clear-cut rejection that everybody is saying. And I noticed that Lavrov's response to the Russian rejection was also fairly moderate, fairly restrained, which does make me wonder whether perhaps more is going on behind the scenes than we actually know, whether at some level there are quiet discussions and saying, look, we can't appear to agree to this now. You've got to give this time, and at some point maybe NATO will agree to negotiate on this, but this can't be for the moment. The Russians are coming back and saying that isn't acceptable. We want those negotiations to happen immediately, and in the meantime, because you're rejecting what we're doing, we're going to take countermeasures. But in practice, perhaps there might be more wriggle room than appears.
Yeah, the Russians and the Chinese, if they are consulting with the Chinese, which I'm sure they are, they're going to start to really turn the screws.
They've
On,
exactly.
yeah.
They've essentially said that. I mean, one thing the Russians have openly hinted now that they're going to do. There's been a statement by a group of Russian MPs from the Russian ruling party, United Russia, saying that because the United States is sending arms to Ukraine,
Right.
Russia should now openly send arms to the militia in the Donbass. And I think that's now almost a certainty, by the way. And of course, the US has got itself in this very difficult situation because, of course, they've been saying that the Russians have been arming the militia in the Donbass all along, and they've tied the sanctions to a Russian invasion. So it looks as if they won't be able to respond, at least not with sanctions, not with those kind of sanctions, to the Russians arming the militia in the Donbass. Though everything is very complicated at the moment, and we can't be sure how this is going to turn out. But we're going to see, it seems to me, a military build-up on the part of the militia in the Donbass. Apparently, its armed forces, and this is extraordinary, are already more heavily mechanized than the Ukrainian military is. In other words, they have perhaps not more tanks than the Ukrainian army does, but more tanks per soldier, more armored vehicles, more artillery, that kind of thing. And now that's going to be beefed up even more. And no doubt they'll be getting anti-aircraft weapons of a sort that could be used to shoot down these Turkish drones. And they could also presumably get radars and also systems to counter these Javelin anti-tank missiles that we've been hearing so much about. So that's I suspect, the first move that the Russians are going to make, that they're going to consult the Chinese, and I'm sure there's going to be other ones.
All right, so let me read you what Lavrov said, and I think it's an interesting comment from Lavrov, and I'm quoting directly from the Russian foreign minister. The big quote is, "There has been no positive response." This is in response to Blinken's proposal to the Russians' security guarantee. Quote, "The main issue is our clear position on the unacceptability of further NATO expansion to the east and the deployment of highly destructive weapons that can threaten the territory of the Russian Federation. It is significant that when our Western colleagues react to our proposals, they always call for the implementation of agreed principles in the Euro-Atlantic. They immediately say this means NATO has the right to expand and no country has the right to prohibit it." First off, no mention of Ukraine in that statement. And the interesting point that Lavrov makes, which I find kind of sums up the Russian position, is NATO says they can expand at will, but what if one country says, no, your expansion threatens our sovereignty? And this is the game-changing narrative shift that Russia's, Putin's almost using judo. He's using the weight of the US and NATO against them to bring them to his position. They're using the media, their media mouthpieces and their propaganda to push Russia invasion of Ukraine, while Russia is just talking about NATO expansion. And they keep on hammering that point, and it seems like they are bringing the weight of the US and NATO. They're using that weight against them to push their the talking point to be about NATO and to start forgetting about this Ukraine stuff. I mean, this is how I'm viewing it: is Russia's invading Ukraine. Russia's invading Ukraine. That's what we're hearing from Europe and the West. But the Russians are firm. This is about NATO expansion, and NATO just doesn't have a blank check to go anywhere it wants, especially if it threatens our sovereignty. I mean, this is a very philosophical kind of issue in a way as well. You know, NATO is saying we can go anywhere we want, and a country has the right to enter into our alliance. But here you have a country saying, fine, we understand that, but what happens when that country that is about to enter your alliance can now become a threat to our sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Russians, of course, have set out in great detail why they say that NATO expansion in that kind of way, in a way that threatens the security of other countries, specifically Russia in this case, violates international law and violates agreements, treaties, going all the way back to the 1970s, that the Western powers have previously agreed to, and various principles that they previously agreed to. But you're absolutely right. The Western powers tried to make this an issue about Ukraine. The Russians have managed to switch it to a discussion about NATO. And of course, the US and NATO doesn't like that at all. They've been trying to refocus this discussion back to the issue of Ukraine. They've been talking up this talk all the time of a Russian invasion. They're now having to calm down upon that because NATO is, Ukraine rather, is becoming increasingly nervous about this. Its economy is crumbling. Now, this is another interesting twist about that press conference, because over the course of it, and this is again something you won't see anywhere in the media, but Blinken admitted that Ukraine's economy is now under extreme stress. And one of the journalists asked him a question, he said, Ukraine's economy is crumbling. Their economy is crumbling. And as a result, the Ukrainians are now coming out and saying, well, please calm down. Stop talking about this Russian invasion story. It is destabilizing us. And so they're having to calm down on that part of the discussion, whilst the Russians press forward with the issue of NATO, which is the one that they're going to run with. And of course, the Russians are going to talk about NATO, even as they send more arms to the militia in the Donbass, and they're now bringing in the Chinese into the discussion.
Final question. Is war baked in the cake with regards to NATO and Russia? Because NATO's existence relies on expansion. And here you have a country that is saying, we understand that your existence relies on expansion, but you can't expand any further because that threatens our sovereignty. I mean, is conflict baked in the cake, whether it's in a month or whether it's in 2-3 years? Without NATO dissolving and disappearing sooner or later, this country and this alliance, they're going to crash.
Yes, that is exactly what's going to happen in my opinion. Now, look, there's two possible outcomes. There's two possible ways to this. Either there is a deal done, and Blinken might have. It's just possible that those words that I quoted at the beginning about that NATO might agree to this, that might be the route to this kind of deal. But as you rightly said, if NATO agrees to that, if NATO agrees to stop its expansion, then NATO starts to unravel because it loses whatever purpose it has. It just fades out. It starts to fall apart. I noticed that some countries in NATO, Bulgaria and Croatia, at least the Croatian president, there's some divisions in Croatia about this, are already starting to question question their loyalties to NATO. They're saying, if there's a war between Russia and NATO, our countries are going to stay out of that war. So things of that kind. So it could be that there is a deal done, or perhaps more probably, we will see some kind of conflict in Ukraine, unless, of course, there is some kind of settlement of the conflict in Ukraine, which is what Macron at the moment is working overtime to try to arrange. But of course, the only kind of settlement in Ukraine would be one on Russian terms. And the Ukrainians, the current government in Ukraine, is incredibly resistant to that. Now, I don't think the Russians are ready to launch a war in Ukraine. I don't think the Russians want to launch a war in Ukraine. We've discussed this many times, but it's possible that the Ukrainians may, and it could very well be that will be the eventual resolution to this. Let me say something else, by the way. I did a big program recently going through the various sanctions programs that the United States has announced, and I've discussed in that program, this is my own channel, why the sanctions actually are not going to be effective. The other thing the sanctions have done is that, of course, they've given the Russians the idea of what the American game plan with sanctions is. The Russians now know what sort of sanctions they might face going down the line. So they know in advance now what the Americans may do to them. There's going to be a committee set up, definitely, an interdepartmental committee in Moscow set up to actually prepare Russia to counter those sanctions. I mean, they've smoked out, if you like, the American ultimate sanctions plan. And the result is that the Russians are going to move forward with that. They're going to move forward with that with the Chinese. They're going to tighten the screws on Ukraine. They're going to see, before very long, Ukraine losing its position as a transit state. They're going to increase their pressure on Europe, their military pressure on Europe. And either they will get this deal, in which case NATO ends, or there will be a war in which the Russians are in a much stronger position because they've already been given all the advance notice of all the things they have to do. And at that point, again, NATO ends. It seems to me that one way or the other, we are looking at the end, the beginning of the end of NATO. I mean, it's not, I know, the conventional wisdom, but that's how it's starting to look increasingly to me.
You know, I was going to say the same exact thing. It's almost as if NATO has done has made the stupidest decision it could possibly make, in that it's bet its entire future on Ukraine. That's really what it looks like. Their whole reason for existence now has become Ukraine, and whether it's a war in Ukraine and Ukraine will get smashed, then NATO can't expand to Ukraine. Hence, NATO has no reason to exist. Whether they work out a deal and prevent war and Ukraine is settled according to Russian terms, NATO doesn't have a reason to exist. Once again, it can't expand to Ukraine. It can't exist. I mean, any way you slice it or dice it, it's unless Ukraine gets into NATO, then NATO is finished.
Yes.
I mean, this is the reality of the situation.
It is the absolute reality of the situation. And of course, it can't get into NATO because the Russians have said it's a red line, and all Western countries, all the governments in the West have said that they're not prepared to fight for Ukraine. So the Russians are prepared to fight to keep Ukraine out of NATO. The Western powers are not prepared to fight to get Ukraine into NATO.
NATO did this to themselves.
They did this to themselves. As I said, a judo move. It's a judo move, but it's also a chess move, if you like. It's a judo move from the Russians and a chess move. I mean, you could say, mate in 12 moves or whatever it is, but you can see the direction of travel now, and it's a series of 4 steps. It's very much how the Russians like to work, by the way. They don't. As I said in previous programs, they don't go for the immediate breakthrough. They maneuver themselves. They build up the pieces until they're ready. They're ready to strike. And as I said, it's quite interesting to see how it's worked. And as you correctly say, NATO did it to themselves. Ideologues, by the way, always fall for these traps because they lack that suppleness, that degree of intellectual clarity to see round them, to see that they are now getting trapped into Ukraine is turning out into a trap for them. Their future is starting to depend on Ukraine, where they can't win.
Yeah, it's completely tied to Ukraine, and this is a trap of their own making. And the Russians just sat back and they let NATO walk into it.
Yes.
And without without Ukraine entering into NATO, NATO's done.
Yes.
And we're seeing the cracks form with Croatia, with Bulgaria. I mean, let's be real. Greece isn't going to get involved. Italy isn't going to get involved. France is not going to get involved. Germany sent like 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. And that was, they're trolling Ukraine. Yeah. They're trolling Ukraine in essence.
Yes.
There is no desire from this military alliance to go to war. None whatsoever.
Exactly. So as I said, it's being exposed in effect as a paper tiger, and a paper tiger where the paper is going to be eventually rolled up and thrown into the bin. And perhaps,
Very,
to be straightforward about it, that's where it belongs.
very, very quickly to close out the video, you did your live on locals yesterday, actually, and there was a question about Turkey's involvement. UK would definitely get involved. Canada is going to send troops. That's fine. But what about Turkey? What do you think Turkey would do if a NATO-Russia conflict?
It's a very good question because, again, Erdogan, as he always does, has overplayed his hand disastrously, and I think more disastrously here than on any other issue, because, of course, he didn't really understand the Russian game plan. He thought he could back Ukraine. He thought that would give him leverage over Putin. He's found that he's not giving him any leverage over Putin. He's going to sell these drones to Ukraine. The Russians are taking steps, with these arms supplies to the militia to counter those drones. He's now apparently asking Putin to visit him in Istanbul, to meet him in Istanbul for a face-to-face meeting. And it's far from certain that Putin is going to come. And if you're asking me what the Turks will do in the event of a war, I don't know. And I don't think Erdogan himself does at this moment. I don't think he is clear where he's going to go. There's been power outages across Turkey. Turkey's having issues with energy. It's finding it difficult to pay for its energy imports. And it needs Russian gas. It needs Russian support to keep its economy going, because, to be straightforward about it, economy's in a terrible mess. So he can't afford to antagonize the Russians, but he's got himself into a situation with Ukraine where he thought he could play some big game, and he's discovering that it doesn't really work like that. So I can't imagine Turkish troops fighting the Russians in Ukraine. I mean, that's just simply not going to happen. I mean, you talk about the British and the others. I mean, none of them are going to send troops to Ukraine. Turkey's not going to do it. Turkey's going to find eventually, if there is a war, that Ukraine's going to be overwhelmingly defeated in an incredibly short space of time. Russians will be once more in control of the whole of the northern coast of the Black Sea, the overwhelmingly dominant military power in the Black Sea, and his position with Russia will be severely compromised. And of course, he can scuttle back to the Americans at that point, but the Americans don't trust him. And of course, it's not what he wants to do anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. The only thing the West has, when you look at everything that we've just discussed in this video and all the videos we've done, the only thing that the United States and the West have at this moment in time is soft media propaganda under the umbrella narrative that Russia is amassing troops on the border of Ukraine and the evil Putin is going to invade the country because he's a dictator and we're democracies. That is literally all they have at this moment in time.
That's all they have. That's all they have.
Yeah.
And of course, using that weapon, though, as I said, has dismayed Ukraine itself. So now we have this bizarre situation where the Ukrainians are coming out and say, for God's sake, stop all this war talk. You're terrifying our people. Our economy is tanking. This can't go on much longer, because, as I said, if you go on like this, there's no Ukraine going to be left. So I mean, even that's the irony. That's the irony. Even that weapon is backfiring on them. It's a classic example, as we've said so many times, when you have an administration with a president who isn't really the president. He can't calculate. I mean, his latest press conference, by the way, was against surreal. I mean, previously he said a week ago that he was guessing that Putin was going to invade. This time he said, well, I don't know. It's all so difficult. I can't make this out in any way. I mean, he came across as utterly befuddled. I mean, he was all over the place. It was a sad thing, actually, to watch and read I mean, he came across as, frankly, very disconnected. So you have a president who isn't in full charge, and an administration, all these various officials, Blinken and all the rest, Sullivan, who are completely out of their depth. And it's beginning to look increasingly as if the sanctions that they're talking about, well, I did a big program about this, the sanctions action are not going to achieve all the things that they expected that they would achieve. And to the extent that they are really problematic for the Russians, which they are in some things, they're now told the Russians what they're going to be, so that the Russians know in advance and can prepare for them.
Yeah.
So announcing your war plan in advance is never perhaps the best strategy. So, the Russians now know that, the Americans are going to try and block advanced chips. So the Russians will work to find or make advanced chips themselves. I mean, they're going to do all those kind of things, and make their banks more resilient when they cut off from dollars, and all those sort of things. As I said, all those comments, you can be absolutely sure they're being analysed in detail in Moscow. And as I said, there's probably already an interdepartmental committee being set up in Moscow to prepare a game plan and a program to make Russia impervious to sanctions like this. And it'll take a little time, but it can be done.
Yeah. Meanwhile, CNN's stupid propaganda is destroying Ukraine before one Russia tank even rolls across the border. That's the stupidity of all of this.
Absolutely. One Russian tank. And of course, bear in mind, Russians are not threatening to invade Ukraine. They're endlessly denying.
I think the defense minister came out of Ukraine the other day and was like, stop everybody, you're destroying our freaking economy. I mean, he's like making a statement. Yes. Stop.
Yes, stop. Exactly. Yes. So, I mean, this is a runaway train that somebody set rolling back in November. I mean, it's curious how this has happened.
Blinken, Biden,
I think Blinken, Biden, Lude, all that crowd. They set it rolling in November, and now, of course, it's run out of control, and it's going to end in a smash with NATO gone, because that it seems to me now is the end point of this thing.
All right, yeah, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and Super U. And go to the Duran shop, use the code GOODDAY, get 10% off all merch. There's that magic mug, which will increase your geopolitical IQ by thousands when you drink from one of our magic mugs.
Yeah.